I wasn't born for drama. I like things simple. Wake up, work hard, enjoy the little things, and sleep with the satisfaction of knowing I've done right by my family. That's the life I built with Lydia, and for the most part I thought we were living it. But it turns out, some storms don't announce themselves with thunder or lightning. Sometimes they come as whispers, as subtle shifts in the wind, and by the time you notice, you're already drenched. It started on an ordinary evening. I just finished dinner and was washing the dishes while Rusty, my old lab mix, snored in his spot by the door. Lydia's hum drifted from the living room, light and aimless, the kind of tune she'd hum when she was focused on her tablet. She had this air of being busy even when she wasn't. "Did you call the plumber about the sink?" she asked, her voice floating into the kitchen. "Already handled," I replied, keeping my tone easy. I was always the one to take care of the small stuff. Pipes, creaky doors, loose cabinet hinges. That was just part of the job of being the husband. She appeared in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame. Her outfit was sharp, almost too sharp for a quiet night at home. Lydia was a real estate agent, so I was used to seeing her dolled up, but something about it seemed out of place tonight. "You're taking the morning off tomorrow?" she asked, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I thought you were working." "I'll be here when the plumber shows up," I said, rinsing the last plate. I turned to catch her expression. A small thing almost imperceptible. Her lips pressed together a little too tightly, and her fingers started drumming against the wood. I didn't say anything, but I noticed. Years in the military teach you to pick up on the smallest details. A shadow out of place, a rustle where there shouldn't be one. Those instincts never really leave you. Later that night, when Lydia disappeared into our bedroom, I lingered in the living room, staring at nothing in particular. Rusty's snores filled the quiet, but my mind was anything but calm. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in my gut. Lydia and I hadn't been connecting the way we used to, but I chalked it up to the usual stresses of life. Her job, my work, bills. But this felt different. And that's when I did something I never thought I'd have to do. See, weeks ago, when Lydia's behavior first started feeling off, I told myself I was just imagining things. But some habits die hard, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to be prepared, just in case. I'd set up a small device in the house, hidden away in a spot she'd never look, allowing me to listen in on her phone calls. I hated myself for it at first. After all, trust is everything in a marriage. But tonight, something told me I'd made the right call. I slipped on my headphones, opened the app, and waited. For a while, there was nothing. Just the faint rustling of sheets as she settled into bed. Then, her voice came through, low and quiet. "Alex doesn't suspect a thing," she said. My heart stopped. She continued, her tone casual, almost rehearsed. "Tomorrow it'll look like an accident, and we'll finally be free." I froze, the weight of her words pressing down on me like a concrete slab. Free? Free from what? From me? The voice on the other end of the call was male, calm and confident. I recognized it instantly. Daniel Carter, her boss. "You just have to keep him distracted," Daniel said. "We'll handle the rest. It's all set for tomorrow." For a long time, I just sat there, the headphones still in my ears, the sound of my own breathing deafening in the quiet room. My first instinct was to barge into the bedroom and demand answers. But I didn't. Instead, I stared at the dark window, my reflection barely visible against the night outside. I knew two things for certain. Lydia had betrayed me, and tomorrow something was going to happen. For years, I told myself my old life was behind me. I wasn't the soldier anymore. I was Alex Hayes, the guy who fixed sinks and played fetch with his dog. But as I sat there, the old part of me stirred awake. The part that knew how to stay calm under pressure, how to gather intel, how to act decisively when the time came. I pulled out my phone and typed a message to Carlos Vega, an old friend from the military. "Need equipment. Urgent." Carlos wasn't the kind of guy who asked questions. He'd show up when I needed him, no matter what. As I pressed send, I glanced toward the hallway where Lydia slept, completely unaware of what I just overheard. The morning would come soon enough, and with it, the storm. The shed smelled like old memories. Oil and metal mingled with the faint scent of sawdust, a reminder of the life I'd built here. Rusty sat by the door, his tail thumping lazily against the wooden floor, watching me work like he always did. But tonight wasn't just another night spent fixing up the house. Tonight, I wasn't Alex Hayes, the guy who played handyman for the neighborhood. Tonight, I was the man I thought I'd left behind. The tools of my former life lay spread out on the workbench in front of me. Motion sensors, a few pieces of surveillance equipment I'd stored away for just in case, and an old but reliable camera I hadn't touched in years. My hands moved with a precision that came naturally, each step bringing back muscle memory from a time I'd hoped to forget. Funny how life works. You spend years trying to quiet the chaos, telling yourself you've earned the right to settle down, only for the chaos to find you anyway. As I tightened the last bolt on one of the camera mounts, I thought about how I got here. It wasn't a sudden thing, it never is. Deception creeps in like a shadow, stretching over everything before you even realize it's there. 3 years ago, Lydia and I had met at a barbecue. A hot July afternoon. The kind where the air felt heavy and conversations drifted lazily between clinking glasses and the sizzle of burgers on the grill. I was standing off to the side, watching the crowd but not really part of it, when she walked up to me. "You look like you're planning your escape," she said, handing me a plate of food. That's how it started, with a joke and a smile. Lydia was radiant, her laugh infectious, and her energy pulled me in like a tide. She was full of ambition, too. I admired that about her. She wasn't afraid to dream big, and for a while, I thought we'd be chasing those dreams together. But ambition can have a dark side. Over time, her drive turned into something else. Something colder, more calculated. I hadn't seen it for what it was back then. I'd chalked up her long hours to a demanding job, her expensive clothes to the image she needed to maintain as a real estate agent. Looking back now, it was all so clear. Every late night, every little shift in her routine, it was all leading to this moment. By the time the sun peeked over the horizon, I had the house fortified. Cameras were tucked into places no one would notice. The corner of the living room, the front porch, even a small one hidden near the kitchen clock. Motion sensors covered every entry point, and I'd mapped out every move an intruder might make. I didn't stop there. Carlos Vega, an old friend and one of the few people I still trusted, was my next call. Carlos wasn't just good with tech. He was a magician with it. If there was a way to track Daniel Carter's movements, to dig into his financial dealings, or to disrupt his plans, Carlos would find it. The line crackled as he picked up. "Alex," he said, his voice sharp and alert. "It's been a while." "Yeah, it has," I replied. "I need a favor. You don't usually call unless it's serious. What's going on?" I told him everything. The conversation I overheard, the feeling in my gut that something big was about to happen. As I laid it all out, I could hear Carlos typing on his keyboard, already working before I'd even finished. "Okay," he said finally. "I can run a trace on Daniel, see what I find. I'll also set up some communication jammers for you. Nothing too obvious, just enough to give you control over the situation if it escalates." "Thanks, Carlos," I said. "I owe you. You owe me a beer. Maybe two. I'll be in touch." With Carlos on board, I felt a small sense of relief, but it was fleeting. There was still so much I didn't know. Why was Lydia doing this? What was her endgame? And how many other people were involved? By the time Lydia came home that evening, I'd scrubbed every trace of my preparation from the house. To her, it was just another ordinary day. She smiled at me over dinner, her tone light and casual as she chatted about her busy day at the office. I nodded along, matching her energy with practiced ease. Inside, though, every word she spoke felt like a dagger. "It's crazy how fast the market's moving," she said, swirling her glass of wine. "We closed 3 deals this week. Daniel's been so on top of everything. It's inspiring, really." I almost laughed. "Inspiring? Sure. Sounds like you're killing it," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Trying to," she replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. As the conversation drifted on, I couldn't help but think about the cameras hidden around the house. They were already recording, capturing every moment, every word. It wasn't just about protecting myself. It was about seeing the truth for what it was. After dinner, Lydia curled up on the couch with her tablet, scrolling through emails or whatever excuse she used to keep herself occupied. I watched her from the kitchen, the weight of what I'd discovered settling heavily on my chest. I wanted to ask her, to look her in the eye and demand answers. But not yet. Timing was everything, and I needed to be sure. Rusty wandered over and nudged my leg, pulling me out of my thoughts. I reached down and scratched behind his ears, the simple motion grounding me. "Tomorrow, buddy," I murmured. "We'll get to the bottom of this." As I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself had changed. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a battlefield, and I was just waiting for the first shot to be fired. The morning started like any other, or at least Lydia made it seem that way. She moved around the kitchen with her usual grace, fixing a quick breakfast and humming under her breath. To anyone watching, she would have looked like the picture-perfect wife. But I knew better now. "Do you need anything before I go?" she asked, her smile bright but her eyes sharp, searching for something. "No, I'm good," I replied, keeping my tone easy. I didn't want to give her a reason to suspect anything. She kissed me on the cheek and grabbed her bag. "I'll see you later," she said as she headed out the door. I stood by the window, watching her until she disappeared down the street. That's when it started. Through the feed from the cameras, I saw her park a few blocks away. She pulled out her phone and made a call. Her face was calm, but her body language gave her away. Quick glances around, her hand gripping the steering wheel just a little too tightly. "He's home," she said, her voice low but clear. "It's all set." The voice on the other end was unmistakable. "Daniel Carter." "Good," he replied. "Just stay where you are. We'll take care of the rest." I watched as she ended the call and leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for a moment like she was trying to steady herself. Whatever was about to happen, she was banking on it going her way. But she didn't know what I'd prepared. Minutes later, a black SUV rolled up outside the house. I zoomed in on the feed, my heart pounding as 3 men stepped out, dressed in black and moving like they'd done this 100 times before. They weren't amateurs, that much was clear. "Let's see how good you really are," I muttered under my breath, my fingers hovering over the control panel I'd set up the night before. The men approached the house cautiously, scanning the area. They didn't notice the small motion sensor I'd placed near the back door. As soon as they crossed the threshold, the sensor triggered a loud crash in the backyard, like someone had knocked over a pile of metal tools. The sound made them freeze. I watched on the monitors as they turned, weapons drawn, their nerves suddenly on edge. It was almost too easy to lead them exactly where I wanted them to go. They entered the house in formation, their movements careful and deliberate. But I'd been one step ahead of them from the start. The cameras followed their every move, and I used the system to keep track of their positions. As they spread out, I activated another sensor, this time upstairs. A faint creaking noise, like footsteps on the floorboards, echoed through the house. It was subtle, but enough to make them pause and glance at each other. "Check it out," one of them whispered, gesturing for another to head upstairs. I smiled to myself, knowing they just walked into my trap. The guy who went upstairs didn't notice the pressure pad I'd hidden beneath the carpet. As soon as he stepped on it, a loud alarm blared from the nearest speaker, disorienting him and sending him stumbling backward. "Clear the rooms," another one barked, his voice tense now. They moved through the house, but no matter where they went, they found only empty rooms and silence. I kept the pressure on, triggering small distractions to keep them guessing. A sudden flicker of lights, the sound of a door creaking open. Every move they made only pushed them closer to the basement. By the time they realized what was happening, it was too late. One by one, I used the equipment I'd set up to isolate them. A hidden trapdoor in the hallway opened beneath the last man, dropping him straight into the basement. I heard his muffled curses through the monitor as he hit the ground. The others were already down there, locked in separate rooms I'd prepared in advance. I'd outfitted each one with reinforced locks and cameras, ensuring I could see them but they couldn't see each other. The house was quiet again, but I wasn't. My heart was racing, and my hands trembled slightly as I checked the feeds to make sure everything was secure. Upstairs, Lydia had no idea what had just happened. She probably thought her plan was going smoothly, that the men she'd sent had handled me without breaking a sweat. But she was wrong. Rusty barked softly from the corner, breaking me out of my thoughts. I leaned down to ruffle his ears, the simple motion grounding me. "Good boy," I murmured. "Now it's time for the next step." I grabbed my phone and sent a quick text to Carlos. "Phase 1 complete. Ready for Phase 2. Carlos replied almost instantly. "Got it. Sending you what I've found on Carter. Check your email." I sat back, staring at the monitors as the reality of what I'd just done began to sink in. The skills I thought I'd never need again had come flooding back, sharper than ever. But this wasn't a mission. This was my life. And it was far from over. The basement was cold and dimly lit, a stark contrast to the warm, inviting house above it. I stood at the edge of the room, watching the 3 men I'd locked away hours earlier. They were bruised, disoriented, and quiet. Rusty's occasional growl echoed faintly down the stairs, as if even he could sense the tension hanging in the air. This wasn't about intimidation, it was about information. "Who hired you?" I asked, my voice calm but firm. The men exchanged glances, their silence stretching out like a challenge. They were professionals, I'd give them that, but they weren't prepared for someone like me. I wasn't just the husband they thought they could sweep aside. "Look," I said, folding my arms. "I know you're here because of Daniel Carter. I know he paid you and I know why. But what I don't know are the details. The meetings, the plan. How deep does this go?" One of them, a wiry guy with sharp eyes, snorted. "You think we're just gonna tell you?" I leaned in slightly, keeping my expression neutral. "I already know enough to bury you," I said. "The cameras, the motion sensors, they've been recording since the moment you showed up. But here's the thing. I'm not interested in you. I'm interested in him. So you can either help me, or you can go down with him." That got their attention. The big guy on the left shifted uncomfortably. "This isn't personal," he muttered. "Maybe not for you," I replied. "But for me, it doesn't get more personal than this." They hesitated for a moment longer, but then the sharp-eyed one broke. "All right," he said. "But if we talk, you make sure this doesn't come back on us." "No promises," I said. "But if you don't talk, I guarantee it'll be worse." That was all it took. Piece by piece, they started talking. They described the meetings, how Daniel had contacted them through a middleman, paying in cash to keep things quiet. They detailed the plan. Make it look like an accident, take care of me, and leave no loose ends. It was surreal, hearing them lay out the details of a plan that was supposed to end my life. But I kept my composure, recording every word. "Why now?" I asked. "Why not weeks ago?" The wiry one shrugged. "Daniel said you were getting too suspicious. Said your wife wasn't sure how much you knew. She wanted to act before you started asking questions." My chest tightened, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I nodded and stepped back. "That's all I need." I left them locked in the basement and went upstairs, Rusty trailing close behind me. I needed to think, to process everything I just learned. But there wasn't time to dwell. The next phase of the plan was already in motion. Back in the living room, I opened my laptop and connected with Carlos. His face appeared on the screen, his expression grim but focused. "I've got good news and bad news," he said without preamble. "Start with the bad," I replied. "Daniel's covering his tracks. He's been moving money around, shutting down old accounts, and transferring assets to new ones. He knows something's off." "And the good news?" Carlos grinned. "I'm faster than he is. I froze the key accounts and set up alerts for any new activity. He won't be able to make a move without us knowing." "That's a start," I said. "What about Lydia?" Carlos hesitated. "She's been in contact with Daniel all morning. They're scrambling. I think she's starting to realize something's wrong, but she doesn't know what." I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. "Keep tracking them," I said. "I need every detail." "You got it." As I ended the call, I glanced at the hidden camera feed from the house. Lydia was in the kitchen, pacing back and forth with her phone pressed to her ear. Her usual poise was gone, replaced by a frantic energy I'd never seen before. "It's not supposed to take this long," she said, her voice sharp and impatient. Daniel's voice came through clearly. "Calm down. We'll figure it out." "Calm down," she snapped. "Alex is still alive and those guys haven't called back. What if something went wrong? What if—" I whispered to myself, watching her every move. The rest of the day passed in a blur of planning and preparation. By the time evening rolled around, I had everything I needed: the recordings, the confessions, and a clear picture of Daniel's involvement. But this wasn't just about collecting evidence. It was about justice. Lydia came home late, her smile strained as she greeted me at the door. "Sorry, work ran over," she said, slipping off her heels. "No problem," I said, keeping my tone light. As we sat down to dinner, I couldn't help but notice the way she avoided my eyes. The cheerful banter she usually brought to the table was gone, replaced by clipped responses and awkward silence. "Long day?" I asked, breaking the tension. "You could say that," she replied, forcing a laugh. "The market's crazy right now." I nodded, letting her believe I was buying the lie. But inside, I was already thinking ahead to what came next. When she finally went to bed, I stayed up, staring at the monitors and watching her toss and turn in the darkness. The woman I'd once loved was now a stranger who'd tried to destroy me. But she hadn't succeeded, and she was about to learn what it felt like to be on the other side. When I woke up the next morning, the air felt different, charged with the kind of tension you can only sense when you know something big is about to happen. Today was the day. All the planning, the traps, the patience, it all led to this moment. Rusty followed me around the house as I went through my usual routine, his tail wagging lazily, completely oblivious to the storm I was about to unleash. Lydia had already left for work, her rushed goodbye barely registering as she grabbed her bag and disappeared out the door. I sat down at my laptop, checking the feeds and ensuring everything was in place. Carlos had been up all night finalizing the broadcast, and the countdown was finally at 0. "Ready when you are," he'd texted me earlier that morning. "Let's do it," I replied. At precisely 10 a.m., Daniel Carter's company website came to life with a live video stream. It wasn't a press conference or a flashy marketing campaign. It was something much more damning. The three intruders sat in a stark, dimly lit room, their faces tense but cooperative. I'd edited the footage to make sure every word they said was clear and undeniable. This wasn't random. One of them began, his voice steady but serious. "We were hired by Daniel Carter. He paid us to." And just like that, they spilled everything. The meetings, the payments, the instructions to make my death look like an accident. It was all there, laid out in painful detail for the entire world to see. The impact was immediate. I watched as the live chat on the website exploded with comments. Investors, employees, and even random viewers reacted in real time, their disbelief and outrage flooding the screen. The video began spreading like wildfire, shared on social media and picked up by news outlets within minutes. Daniel Carter's carefully constructed world was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. At her office, Lydia had no idea what was happening until one of her coworkers burst into the room. "Lydia, have you seen this?" they asked, holding up their phone. She frowned, confused, and reached for her tablet. When she pulled up the video, her face went pale. I could only imagine what was running through her mind as she watched the intruders confess to everything. "No, no, no," she muttered, frantically dialing her phone. But Daniel wasn't picking up. Across town, Daniel was in his office, pacing like a trapped animal. His phone rang nonstop, but every time he tried to answer, the line went dead. His computer screen was filled with frantic emails from investors pulling out, demanding answers, and severing ties. I watched him through the hidden camera I'd planted during one of my late-night reconnaissance missions. "Call them again," he barked at someone off-screen, his voice laced with desperation. But it was no use. Carlos's communication jammers were doing their job perfectly. No calls, no texts, no emails. Daniel was completely cut off. Back at home, I sat in front of the monitors, sipping coffee as I watched the chaos unfold. It was surreal seeing the plan come together so flawlessly. Every move they made, every attempt to regain control, only pushed them further into the trap I'd set. For years, Daniel had lived in a world where money and power shielded him from consequences. He thought he could buy his way out of anything. But now, he was learning the hard way that some things couldn't be fixed with a checkbook. By noon, the video had been picked up by every major news outlet. Reporters camped outside Daniel's office, their cameras capturing every frantic gesture, every failed attempt to escape the questions being hurled at him. "Mr. Carter, do you have any comment on the allegations? Is it true you hired men to harm someone? Have you spoken to the authorities yet?" Daniel's usual composure was gone, replaced by the panicked movements of a man who knew his time was running out. Lydia, meanwhile, was unraveling in her own way. She sat in her car in the office parking lot, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She'd been calling Daniel nonstop, leaving voicemail after voicemail, but she was getting nowhere. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she whispered, her voice shaking. What went wrong? She didn't know it yet, but her carefully constructed life was about to collapse as well. By the end of the day, the fallout was impossible to ignore. Daniel's accounts had been frozen, his investors had pulled out, and law enforcement had gotten involved. The intruder's confessions were enough to open a full-scale investigation, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the authorities came knocking on his door. As for Lydia, she was stuck in limbo, caught between her loyalty to Daniel and the sinking realization that her part in all of this was about to come to light. I sat in the quiet of my living room that evening, the weight of everything settling over me. It wasn't over yet. There were still pieces to move, still truths to reveal. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was finally in control. It's a strange thing watching a man like Daniel Carter fall apart. Men like him, they thrive on power, on control. They walk into a room, flash their perfect smiles, and make you believe they own the world. And maybe for a while they do. But power built on lies doesn't last. Sooner or later, the cracks show. And when they do, the whole thing collapses. By midweek, Daniel's life was in shambles. I watched it unfold from the comfort of my living room. Every news outlet ran the same story. Local real estate mogul accused of conspiracy and fraud. Clips of Daniel's arrest played on repeat, showing him being led out of his office in handcuffs. His carefully curated image shattered in front of the cameras. The charges were enough to ensure he wouldn't walk free anytime soon. Conspiracy to commit assault, wire fraud, and tampering with evidence. His list of crimes was long, and the evidence was airtight. But that wasn't the best part. What made it truly satisfying was the look on his face during the arrest. His expression wasn't anger or defiance. It was confusion. He couldn't wrap his head around how this had happened, how his perfectly executed plan had crumbled so completely. The truth was simple. He underestimated me. From what I'd gathered, the cracks started forming the moment the live video hit his company's website. Investors pulled out in droves, and employees scrambled to distance themselves from the fallout. His office, once bustling with activity, became a ghost town overnight. Even his family turned on him. Daniel had always projected this image of the perfect family man, but behind the scenes, his relationships were as hollow as his promises. His wife filed for divorce the day after his arrest, citing irreconcilable differences. His teenage daughter, who once idolized him, refused to visit him in custody. He was alone now, completely and utterly alone. The day after his arrest, I drove to the post office with a thick envelope in hand. Inside was every piece of evidence I'd collected, recordings, financial documents, and the confessions from the 3 men he'd hired. I made sure it was addressed to the lead investigator on the case, with copies sent to Daniel's attorney and the media. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about making sure the truth came out no matter what. As I handed the envelope to the clerk, I felt a strange sense of closure. I'd spent weeks gathering this evidence, replaying every detail in my mind, and now it was out of my hands. "It's all yours now," I thought, walking back to my car. Meanwhile, Daniel sat in a small, windowless room, the kind of place that strips a man down to his barest self. The polished suits, the expensive watches, they didn't matter here. All he had was time. Time to think about how he'd ended up in this place. From what I'd heard, he wasn't taking it well. He replayed the events over and over, trying to find the moment where things had gone wrong. How could Alex, the quiet, unassuming husband of his mistress, have outsmarted him? None of this makes sense, he reportedly told his lawyer during one of their meetings. He's just some construction worker. The lawyer, apparently unimpressed, simply nodded and scribbled notes on a pad of paper. What Daniel didn't understand, what he wouldn't understand, was that I'd spent years preparing for moments like this. The military had taught me more than just strategy and discipline. It had taught me how to read people, how to stay calm under pressure, and how to adapt when things went sideways. Daniel thought his money and connections made him untouchable, but he'd made one critical mistake. He underestimated me. The fallout wasn't limited to Daniel. His company, once a powerhouse in the local real estate market, collapsed within days. With no leadership and a string of scandals tarnishing its name, clients and investors abandoned ship. Lawsuits piled up, and bankruptcy became inevitable. For a man like Daniel, losing his company was worse than losing his freedom. That business wasn't just his livelihood, it was his identity. Without it, he was just another man who'd flown too close to the sun. I kept tabs on everything, though I never felt the need to gloat. The satisfaction I felt wasn't about seeing him suffer. It was about knowing he couldn't hurt anyone else. Still, there was one loose end I hadn't tied up yet. Lydia. For weeks, she'd been a part of this, feeding into Daniel's schemes and playing her role to perfection. She thought she'd get away with it, that I'd never see the truth. But now, as Daniel's world burned around him, I wondered how long it would take her to realize she was next. That evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Rusty rested his head on my knee. His simple loyalty was a reminder of what really mattered. The truth was, this wasn't just about taking down Daniel. It was about reclaiming my life, about proving to myself that I wasn't powerless. I glanced at my phone, where a new message from Carlos had just come through. Lydia's phone has been quiet, but I'm keeping an eye on her. Thanks, I replied. She hadn't tried to contact me all day, which wasn't surprising. She was probably scrambling, trying to figure out how to distance herself from the mess she'd helped create. But she couldn't run forever. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of the day finally catching up to me. The storm wasn't over yet, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could see the light at the end of it. The thing about betrayal is that it doesn't just destroy trust. It destroys the person who betrayed, too. Lydia learned that the hard way. Her world didn't just fall apart. It imploded, leaving nothing but wreckage in its wake. It started with the video. The footage of her conspiring against me with Daniel spread across every platform you could think of. News outlets picked it up, labeling her as the scheming real estate agent. While social media tore her apart, the comments were brutal. People called her everything from a liar to a monster, and as much as I hated seeing her dragged through the mud, I knew it was nothing compared to the damage she tried to inflict on me. I didn't have to lift a finger. The court of public opinion handled it all. By the time her boss caught wind of the scandal, it was over. She was fired immediately. Her real estate license was revoked, and any hope of rebuilding her career was gone. She moved out of our house the following week. The house we'd bought together, the one we'd spent years turning into a home. It was mine now. She didn't even try to fight me for it. I think she knew she'd already lost. I watched from the window as she loaded a few boxes into her car. Her shoulders were hunched, her movements slow, like she was carrying the weight of the world on her back. For a moment, I thought about going out there, about saying something. But what was there to say? She'd made her choices, and now she had to live with them. Her new apartment was a far cry from the life she'd grown accustomed to. A small, modest place on the edge of town, tucked between a laundromat and a rundown diner. It was the kind of place she'd once looked down on, back when we were still building our life together. Carlos had sent me pictures of the place, along with updates on her attempts to rebuild. She'd applied for a few jobs, but no one would touch her. The scandal followed her everywhere, and the real estate community wasn't quick to forgive. I wasn't trying to keep tabs on her out of spite. I just wanted to know she was staying out of trouble. The final nail in the coffin came a few weeks later. I left her a note. Nothing dramatic, nothing cruel. Just a simple reminder of the truth she couldn't escape. I know, and I always did. I slipped it into her mailbox and walked away, the words echoing in my mind as I left. It wasn't about revenge anymore. I didn't need to see her suffer, didn't need to gloat. I just wanted her to understand that actions have consequences, that trust is something you don't get back once it's broken. I wish I could say I felt relief or closure or something, but the truth is it was bittersweet. Lydia had been my wife, my partner, the person I thought I'd spend my life with. Watching her fall apart didn't bring me joy, it just brought me clarity. The woman I loved didn't exist anymore. Maybe she never did. Now the house feels quieter than ever. Rusty's still here, loyal as always, and the tools of my trade are still scattered in the shed. Life moves on, one day at a time. Sometimes I catch myself thinking about what could have been, about the life we'd planned and the future we dreamed of. But those thoughts don't last long. The past is the past, and I've learned to leave it there. Lydia, wherever she is, will have to face her own demons. As for me, I'm moving forward, one step at a time, knowing that I came out of this storm stronger than I ever thought I could be. The sun was just peeking over the hills when I opened the door to my shop. The soft, golden light spilled across the freshly swept floor, highlighting the smell of sawdust and varnish that had become as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. This was my life now. Simple, quiet, honest. I ran my hand over the smooth edge of a table I'd finished the night before, the grain of the wood catching the light just right. There was a kind of therapy in the work, taking raw, imperfect pieces and shaping them into something whole, something meaningful. The sign outside read Wilson Woodworks. Not Alex Hayes, but James Wilson. A name I'd chosen as a way to step into a new chapter, leaving behind the chaos and betrayal that had defined my old life. The shop wasn't much, just a single room with a workbench, a few tools, and some pieces of furniture waiting to be picked up by their owners. But it was mine. Every inch of it was built from the ground up, a reflection of the life I'd fought to rebuild. Rusty lay by the door, his head resting on his paws as he watched the world pass by. He'd adjusted to our new surroundings faster than I had, greeting every customer with a wag of his tail and a curious sniff. I envied his simplicity sometimes. To Rusty, life was all about the next meal, the next walk, the next moment of companionship. There was no room for regret or what-ifs. Carlos still sent me updates now and then. "Thought you'd want to know," his last message read. Daniel was still in prison, his appeals denied one after the other. The empire he'd built had crumbled completely, leaving him with nothing but a tarnished name and a string of legal battles he'd never win. As for Lydia, her life had continued its slow spiral downward. She'd burned every bridge she had, and the last I'd heard, she was bouncing between odd jobs, trying to stay afloat. I didn't feel much when I read those updates anymore. No satisfaction, no anger, just a quiet acceptance that the past was the past. I hadn't replied to Carlos's message yet, but I would eventually. He was one of the few people who'd stood by me when the storm hit, and I owed him more than I could ever repay. The people in this new town didn't ask many questions, which suited me just fine. To them, I was James Wilson, the quiet guy with the woodworking shop and the friendly dog. There was a kind of freedom in being anonymous. No one here knew my story, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could just exist without the weight of my old life pressing down on me. Sometimes, though, the memories would creep in. Late at night, when the shop was dark and the only sound was Rusty's steady breathing, I'd think about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the schemes, the chaos. It was all still there, tucked away in the corners of my mind. But those moments didn't last as long as they used to. The scars Lydia and Daniel left behind were still there, but they'd faded with time. I'd learned to live with them, to see them as reminders of the strength I didn't know I had. One morning, a customer walked into the shop, an older man with a kind smile and a soft southern drawl. James Wilson? He asked, holding out a hand. That's me, I said, shaking his hand. I've been hearing about your work all over town, he said, glancing around the shop. Figured I'd come see it for myself. He picked up a chair I'd finished last week, turning it over in his hands to inspect the craftsmanship. You've got a gift, he said finally. I'll take it. I thanked him, wrapping up the chair and helping him load it into his truck. As he drove away, I felt a small surge of pride. This life I'd built, this quiet, unassuming life was mine. It wasn't flashy or exciting, but it was real. Somewhere in the world, Lydia was probably still chasing something. An opportunity, a second chance, maybe even forgiveness. But I wasn't chasing anything anymore. I'd found what I was looking for. Peace. Rusty nudged my hand with his nose, pulling me out of my thoughts. All right, buddy, I said, scratching behind his ears. Let's take a walk. We stepped outside into the crisp morning air, the town waking up around us. The future stretched out ahead, wide open and full of possibilities. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what it might hold.